Okay, good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us today on the next instalment of our webinars, normally called Wednesday webinars, but obviously this is a rearranged session originally due to take place on the 14th of September, but obviously couldn't do so for obvious reasons, but the sad passing of the Queen and the associated restrictions that came with that. So I'm really pleased and delighted that you're able to come and join us on a Tuesday at this rearranged time. My name's Darren Hartley. I'm Chief Exec of TAROE Trust, and I'm joined today by John Goodwin of the Housing Ombudsman Service. Before I hand over to John, I'll just a few kind of housekeeping things. Once again, for those that have attended previous sessions, we're hosting this on the Zoom webinar platform. So we've got a chat function which you're all invited to make use of as we go through. Automatically everybody's muted, but there is the option that we can, if you wanted to ask questions, that we can kind of unmute you and bring you into the discussion as we go through also. Today's session is being recorded. So for those that are unable to see this in live timing, then hopefully a copy of this recording will be on our YouTube channel later today. I guess without further ado, I'm going to hand over to John. I know John's prepared some slides and he's going to share those. There's going to be options for questions, as we said, throughout for pause, and then there'll be a chance for a discussion towards the end. We're aiming for about an hour or so for today's session. In terms of what John's going to talk about, there's been a lot of change at the Housing Ombudsman, and certainly a lot of change as part of the kind of broader changes that are being brought forward from the white paper and the shift towards more proactive consumer side focus and regulation. So John's going to talk a little bit about some of the both recent and scheduled updates and changes at the Ombudsman Service, some changes in the scope of the service, some changes to the complaint handling code, some things around performance and naming and shaming, which we've been asking for quite a while, and pleased to see that that's developed. A little bit on the spotlight reports and some about the future changes to look out for as well. So hopefully today's session is going to be really informative for you. Then towards the very end, I'll give a little bit of an update as well on a few other sector developments that have been happening over the last couple of weeks. So I'm going to mute myself and I'll be silent, but I'll be here in the background and I'll be monitoring. So there's the option for me to come in, John, if required. Great to hand over to you. Really pleased to have you here today. Welcome, John.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Darren. Good morning, everyone. I'll put the slides up in a moment, but let me introduce myself. So my name is John Goodwin. My job title is, I'm having to look at it because I forget what it is, Compliance and Systemic Lead at the Housing Ombudsman Service. I'm going to put my slides up, which should have that on the opening slide. And everyone see that okay. I think since you're muted, you can't really tell me, but hopefully you can all see that okay. And I am, so Compliance and Systemic Lead is my job title. I'll just say what it is, because it's a bit of a woolly title, isn't it? It's not the best of job titles. I am part of a team which carries out the more serious investigations if we get particularly difficult complaints, and particularly where if we get a number of complaints against the same landlord, so we make a number of findings against them, maladministrations, we might carry out a more serious investigation, which we call a systemic investigation. And I'm going to touch on that later. So I'm part of the team that does that, but I'm also in that team responsible for doing quite a lot of the training, the workshops and webinars, often with landlords and their staff, but also with residents as well. And I'm really, really pleased to be asked to this. We thought it wasn't going to happen because it got cancelled, as Darren said, a couple of weeks ago. And I'm actually leaving the Ombudsman Service. I've been there 11 years. I'm leaving on Friday. So I thought it wasn't going to happen, but we managed to squeeze it in. And this will be my final workshop. I've been delivering them for a number of years. So it's a really nice way to round off doing something for residents, because we tend to have a lot of contact with landlords. It can be harder for us to find ways of communicating with residents. We do some work through TPAS, who I'm sure you're familiar with. We sometimes do work for tenant panels, but any time we've got an opportunity to speak to residents about complaint handling, we're really happy to do so. There's already a question. No, it's not a question in the chat. I think that's fine. So as Darren said, I'm going to go through the agenda now, but if you do have questions, you can put them in the chat. You can type something into the chat. You can also hold your hand up by, there should be a button at the bottom of your screen that says reactions, and in there you'll see a raised hand. But I'll sort of probably do a couple of slides and then see if you've got any questions, just so that you don't have to listen to me for too long, then do another couple. I'll leave lots of time at the end for questions, because really this is your session. There might be things that I haven't covered that you want to ask about. So it's really important that you get the time to do that. Okay, so without further ado, if I can get my slides to move on, which I'm not at the moment, in a sec. Oh, here we are. There we go. So what I'm going to cover is, I think Darren really mentioned this, recent changes at the Ombudsman Service, in particular changes to what we call the Housing Ombudsman Scheme, which is our overall governing document, sets out everything we do. There's some changes that have happened recently, more changes coming on the 1st of October, which is Saturday. So very timely to have this. I'll tell you about those. We've also made recent changes to our complaint handling code. I'll tell you more about that, because it's a really important document for us. This is, in some ways, it's more important than the scheme. The code is what landlords should be doing for you as residents on the ground, how they should be handling complaints. And it sets out, benchmarks, but it also sets out our expectations. And there are things we can do if landlords don't meet those expectations. So I'll tell you about that. Say a bit about landlords' performance. How are they performing on complaints? And what do we do if they're not performing well? So as Darren mentioned, something around naming and shaming. We publicise a lot more information than we used to, and we do name landlords in that information. I'm going to tell you about our Spotlight reports. It's a series of more in-depth reports on different subjects. The most recent ones were on subjects like cladding, the cladding debate last year, and damp and mould, which has been in the news a lot. So I'll tell you a bit more about them. And so the future changes coming up. So there's some changes coming up next week. For example, any of you who are familiar with the designated person process, and if you're not, I'll explain what it is. That is being removed from the 1st of October. So I am going to explain that. But as I say, there'll be time for questions if there's things that I haven't covered that you want to talk about, or you've got questions about points I have made. So I just thought I'd start off by just make sure you all understand what our role is. Some of you might know about the Ombudsman more than others. So I'll give you a little bit of background and then say something about the updates. So Housing Ombudsman, it covers England. We just cover England. There's other Ombudsman services for other countries in the UK. And all social landlords in England must be members of what's called the Housing Ombudsman Scheme, which is this. It's on our website, more usefully than my paper copy. And as I said earlier, that's what sets out what we do, how we do it. If you want to see the real nitty-gritty, have a look at that. It's not the most user-friendly document. It could be plainer English, but it is the one that really sets out all the detail of what we do. And I'm going to say a bit more about the updates to that later on. So if you're a council or a housing association, they're the main members. They're social landlords. They must be members of the Housing Ombudsman Scheme. What does that mean? It means they must have a complaint procedure that residents can go through. They must tell residents about that complaint procedure. And at the end of the complaint procedure, if the resident's not happy, then they must tell them that they can take that complaint to us at the Ombudsman, and we'll look again at it independently. So we're independent of landlords and residents. We look at it fresh and we make a decision. You could say we're like a free alternative to a court. So all social landlords must be members. It's primarily, that's all the local authorities, which we've got 329 of. but most of our members, nearly 2,000, are housing associations, because the housing association sector these days, as you probably know, is much bigger than the local authority sector. However, that's less housing associations than we had a few years ago, because a number of them are merging. And you might also know about that some are now very large. They're much larger than the biggest councils, and those mergers are continuing for various reasons, some of which are driven by finance. Housing associations think they can deliver services better and cheaper if they merge. Whether that's true or not, I'm not here to judge, but that's the theory. So those are all social landlords. There's also very small social landlords like cooperatives and almshouses. If they're registered with the regulator of social housing, they must be a member of the Ombudsman scheme and let their residents come to us. So that's the social landlords. In addition, we have 71 private landlords who are voluntary members. So if you're a private landlord in England, there's no requirement to be a member of any ombudsman scheme. Your residents don't, your tenants don't have a right to go to an ombudsman. The government has been saying for some time, but is saying more forcefully at the moment that it wants to change that so that private landlords are covered by an ombudsman. At the moment, there isn't any requirement, but they can join us voluntarily if they wish to, and we have 71 voluntary members. It's far from ideal, because I remember I've been at the Ombudsman now 11 years, and I'll say I'll leave this week. I remember when I'd been there a couple of years, I was a caseworker before I did my present job, and I investigated a private landlord complaint. I made a finding of maladministration against that private landlord. And at the end of the year, they didn't renew their membership because it was voluntary. So that's why it doesn't really work very well to have a voluntary scheme. So what's our role? What do we do? Well, we do the obvious thing of making decisions. That's what ombudsmen do. We make final decisions in disputes. They come to us, we investigate them. I can say more about how we investigate them later if you want. I wasn't going to include that, but do ask questions. And we make a decision. But we have a second role as well, which is, it's set out in the Housing Ombudsman Scheme. We support dispute resolution and promote change in the sector. So what that means is we do a lot of work with landlords and residents before complaints come to us. You know, we would rather the complaints were resolved before they came to us in the first place. So that's why we do training, workshops for landlord staff and for residents. Landlord staff and residents can phone us up, even if the complaint isn't with us, for some advice about taking the complaint through the complaints process. So we're different from other ombudsmen. Most ombudsman services simply do the first thing there, the decision making. They don't put work into trying to resolve disputes earlier down the track. And we've been really focusing on that in recent years. Okay, I think someone else is just entering the session. Okay. All right. And as I said, there's been updates. The Housing Ombudsman Scheme was updated in 2020. That was the last major update. And that the main reason for it being updated then was to include these new, what we call systemic investigations, the ones that I'm involved in. So this is where it's not just a landlord getting something wrong on one case, but if we see a number of cases on similar issues over a similar time, over a short period of time from the same landlord, we might want to look more deeply about what's going wrong at that landlord. You know, is there a problem with a particular service or contractor? So we can carry out this more deep investigation into the landlord rather than into a particular resident's complaint. So our usual work is to take a specific complaint from a resident. If you've got, let's say you've got damp in your flat, you complain to the landlord, you're not happy with how they dealt with that complaint, you bring that complaint about that property and that damp to us, and we'll investigate it. This new power, systemic, lets us look at broader issues that are recurring from different, we see different complaints against the same landlord. We can then interview the landlord staff, we can look at a number of complaints over a period of time and publish a report. We're about to publish one of those reports. I can't say too much about it because it's not published, but I think probably the second week in October, probably be in the Housing Press. We're publishing a special investigation report on on one of the larger landlords in England. And we also, in 2020, another reason for updating the Housing Ombudsman Scheme was because we had introduced the Complaint Handling Code, which I'm going to talk more about on the next slide. So the scheme now says, not only do you have to do the things you always had to do as a landlord, but you must comply with the Complaint Handling Code. And the things set out in there, such as timescales for handling complaints, telling your residents that they can come to the Ombudsman, etc. So I'll say a bit more about that later. And finally, as I say, there's going to be a new version of the scheme that comes out, is published on Saturday. It should be on our website. I don't know if it's on our website yet or whether it goes live on Saturday. The main reason for that update is because the government is removing the designated person process. And I'm going to say more about that later on, but this is the process where at the end of the complaints procedure with your landlord, before coming to us, if you want to, you don't have to, but if you want to, you can take the complaint to a councillor, member of parliament, or a tenant panel and ask them if they could help you to resolve it with the landlord. The idea was that that then gets resolved before it goes to the Ombudsman. For various reasons, it's not been seen as an effective process. It was introduced in 2013 and it's being abolished. So in future, from Saturday onwards, at the end of the complaints process, the resident can come straight to us. At the moment, they have to wait 8 weeks. They can come to us in 8 weeks, and during that 8 weeks, they've got that option of going to a designated person. I'll say a bit more about that later on because it's a bit difficult to follow if you've never actually used it. But the good news probably for you is you don't have to worry about that because it won't exist after Saturday. Okay. I think there's one comment in the chat. I'll just see if I can pick that up now. Well, there's a couple, aren't there, actually?
Hey, John.
Yes, Darren.
Can you hear me? Yeah, just picking up on the comments, really. I guess they're along the same theme in the sense, because we've had one from Cyril, which really raised the issue about awareness of the scheme, because obviously if tenants are not aware of your existence, it's very difficult to take advantage of the services that you're offering. Yeah. So I guess the first question, taking on what Cyril said, is just about, what has been happening in order to raise awareness of access amongst residents to the scheme. And as I say that, to give you a little bit of kind of time to think about it, I am aware that there's some things that are said in the code in relation to requirements to promote it from a landlord themselves. But I am also aware that there's been some publicity and promotions by the departments of levelling up housing and communities, or DLUC as they're calling themselves for short, and that there's going to be a second round of that planned also. Is there anything you can say just in the first part, and then I'll interrupt again, just around awareness?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, and I think you're right. I think certainly when I joined the Ombudsman, as I said, it was 11 years ago, I think we were very poor at raising awareness. It's very much an organisation that just received the complaints, carried out the investigations, issued the decisions. And we didn't do any of that work at the early stage to try and resolve things. We didn't run any webinars like this. And I'm certainly not going to say what we do now is perfect. I think there's a long way to go, but we have done quite a lot in the last 2 or 3 years. So primarily, and I'll mention this on the coming slides, because the code, when it was introduced, does have a lot to say about how landlords should be accessible, but also make sure that they tell residents about the Ombudsman, not just one time at the end of the complaints procedure, but at all appropriate times. So in every complaint response, in any other relevant communications. So that work has been going on. We've got some other work going on about trying to promote our services. We've just appointed, I think this week, a new post around accessibility to make sure we're accessible. That person will be particularly looking at, are there residents, are there, particular age groups, perhaps people from particular areas of the country who aren't using the Ombudsman service as much as others, and what do we need to do to reach out to them? And then in addition to that, as Darren said, as you said, Darren, the government after this really flows from the Grenfell fire and the green paper after that, which I'm going to mention on the next slide, they decided a lot more awareness work was needed. And they've run a couple of campaigns around awareness of landlords' complaints procedures and the Ombudsman. Some of that was on social media, which some residents will pick up on, but others probably don't use social media. Some of it was in leaflets. But I think they're very fair points that we've got a lot more to do in that area. Did you want to ask something else at this stage, Darren?
I thought it might be worthwhile picking up on what Alan's raised now as well, because it kind of flows directly from that. Is that even if you can raise awareness, I guess there's also a question about scope, isn't there, as to who is entitled to bring a matter to the Housing Ombudsman Service, and sometimes we do get this because which is, I think there might have been some shifts in recent years on the approach there, because historically I'm aware that there was kind of almost like a process where you have to exhaust everything through you get to the end of the complaints process. And if you've completely exhausted the internal complaints resolution procedure of your individual landlord, it's then that you could kind of take the issue to the Housing Ombudsman. And if they hadn't done that, then that was it. But I don't think it's such a blanket situation now, is it? I mean, I know that that's still kind of the central element, but I think there is a bit more nuance now, is there?
Yes, yes, and it's that point really I mentioned about this move over the last 3 or 4 years towards us trying to help resolve complaints earlier. I mean, I'll just say something more about our scope. So really our scope is, if you're reason I use the word resident is you could be a tenant, but you could also be a leaseholder. You could also be a licensee. So we mostly deal with tenants, but we get a lot of leaseholders. So anyone who's got some legal agreement with a social landlord to occupy accommodation, whatever it is, lease, tenancy, they can come to us. But as Darren rightly says, we can only investigate that complaint and issue a decision on that complaint and make any orders to the landlord once you've exhausted the landlord's complaints procedure. So if someone phones us up, the first thing we say is, have you complained to your landlord? If they say yes, we say, have you got a final decision? They say yes. We say, can we see that decision? And why aren't you happy with it? Because that's the starting point. They're coming to us because they're not happy with that decision. So that is tradition. That's what we do. That's traditionally what we did. And we can still only formally investigate a complaint. We have to give the landlord the opportunity to resolve it first. However, as Darren says, you can now call us at any stage, so can landlord staff, but residents, if you're having difficulties, either because the landlord won't accept a complaint, or they won't escalate it to the next stage, or they're not responding within reasonable time. So if a tenant's in that situation, you know, they've made a complaint, they don't hear anything for weeks or months, it would be wrong of us to say, well, we can't look at it because you haven't exhausted the landlord's process. Then you're caught in this catch-22. So you can call us. We can't at that stage. You might say, well, the damp is terrible. We can't investigate the damp because you've got to go through the complaints procedure. But we would get straight onto the landlord and say, look, this person's made a complaint. They haven't received a response. You need to respond now. We usually give them a deadline, might be within 5 days. And if they don't, we can make orders now. We have the power to make orders around their complaint handling, saying you must send a response. If a landlord still, this does happen occasionally, if a landlord still didn't respond to us or deal with the complaint, then we have the power to say, right, we've given you the opportunity. We'll regard that complaint as having exhausted the landlord's complaints process. We will now investigate it because you've had a fair chance to take it through your procedure. So that is the process. It has changed, but we can only investigate complaints that have exhausted the procedure. However, we can make that decision. It's exhausted the procedure earlier if necessary. Does that answer? I don't know if that answers it for Alan's point of view. Do you think it does, Darren? Alan can come back if not.
Yeah, that sounds great. I mean, the other one is there's often the question of what's a residence and who can come to you. And I think that was really clear response on the scope that it's not just tenants. This is broader. because that's sometimes something where we get direct questions there. And
yeah, shared owners, leaseholders, anyone with an agreement. And actually, although obviously we get less complaints from leaseholders, those are often the more difficult ones, you know, to investigate, because they're quite often we get groups of leaseholders who might be complaining about the building as a whole, or service charges or something like that. So those can be quite complicated, wide scope complaints.
So John, we've just got Alan as well. He's pleased with that. So that's great. Well done. Thanks.
Okay. Shall I move on to the next slide? I seem to be having a trouble with my. Oh no, here we are. There we go. Right. Okay. So just check I haven't missed the slide, because my laptop's very slow at moving on. So I don't want to miss out. I've only got 4 slides, but it's quite a lot to cover. Yeah, so this will really pick up on some of those points that you were making there, that Alan was asking about, and that Darren was asking about, around, you know, how has our role changed and why has it changed? And a lot of this stems back to the Grenfell fire, really, because we had the Grenfell fire was in 2017. Tragic fires, you know, really, you know, horrendous. I was at an event last Wednesday where one of the survivors actually spoke to a meeting of all the Ombudsman staff, and it was very, very powerful. You know, he was in his flat and he narrowly managed to escape. So very harrowing, but it led to 2 things, really. It led to, obviously, the concerns and the actions that are being taken around building safety, and the cladding and the safety of the materials. And a lot of that has now been taken forward in Building Safety Act, which has recently become an act. There's going to be a building safety regulator, etc. But there was another side to it as well that was picked up on shortly after the fire, where residents were saying, well, we had told the council we had concerns. We had tried to raise complaints, but they never listened to us. So the government did pick up on this in a green paper that they published the year after, 2018. There's a whole chapter, there's only 5 chapters, I think, in that green paper, a whole chapter in that on complaints. And there was a lot of that, they'd done a lot of consultation with residents around the country, and they got this message from residents that feeling that, well, we don't know about the Ombudsman. We don't know how a landlord's meant to handle our complaints. We didn't know who to complain to. So the government has taken those concerns forward in other bits of legislation, which have become a white paper. And now you've got legislation that's coming in around social housing regulation, but also at the Ombudsman, we took it forward by publishing the Complaint Handling Code. So those changes are meant to try and make sure that that landlords are accountable to residents, that landlords tell residents about their complaint procedure, about the Ombudsman, and that residents can see how their landlord is performing. I'll touch on this later. This is new measures that are coming in shortly from the regulator of social housing that will be published each year. And so if there are concerns being raised, hopefully it's going to be more obvious at an earlier stage that a number of residents are raising the same concerns about the same issues. So it's, you know, I don't think anyone can say that it could never happen again, but it will make something like Grenfell hopefully a lot less likely to happen again. You know, it might be a different type of problem. It might be around gas safety, etc. But, you know, if you can pick up on residents' concerns at an earlier stage, you're more likely to avoid those. So that's the background. I think a lot of this stemmed from those concerns that came to light about residents not being listened to at Grenfell. And we were planning to publish the code anyway, but we then strengthened it in the basis of what came out of Grenfell and the Green Paper. So the Complaint Handling Code, it was published in July 2020. It sets out what we see as the standards, the benchmarks that a landlord should use when handling a complaint. So it's got a definition of a complaint, I'm going to mention on the next slide. It's got timescales. It's got bits around what they should do if they get things wrong, how to provide a remedy, how to learn from complaints, how to report complaints, how to provide access for complaints, etc. And it is quite practical. And we also have powers, if a landlord isn't complying with it, to serve an order. It's called a complaint handling failure order. So it's not an order about the complaint itself, which might be the damp. This is an order saying, you must change your complaints procedure, or you must deal with this complaint within this time scale. So we have much stronger powers, which I'm going to go into on the next slide. And the code came from a combination of what we saw as best practice across the sector and what we'd seen in our own casework, but also we did a lot of consultation with residents and landlords across the sector. So that was introduced July 2020. We've brought in a revised edition in April this year. It's on our website. I would encourage you to look at it. It's written in fairly plain English. It's meant to be easy to read. It's much easier to read than the Housing Ombudsman Scheme. So the revised code came into effect in April 2022. Much of it was the same as the original, but we've strengthened it in some areas. We believe we've strengthened it from a resident's point of view, but in some areas we've given landlords a little bit more flexibility when they need more time to handle a complaint, so long as that is in agreement with the complainant. So I'm going to run through that in a moment. And again, the revisions we did in April, that's because really the code in 2020 was produced quite quickly because of the concerns after Grenfell. So it was by no means perfect. And then we saw how it operates in practice. There were things we wanted to tweak and strengthen. So we were able to do that in April this year. But again, we did landlord and tenant surveys. We looked at the frequently asked questions we'd had on the original version of the code. And we also consulted with other ombudsman services to see how do they set benchmarks for their sectors. So we came up with revised code, and that is a copy of it here, just to show that these things do exist. I'm not making it up. So now I'm trying to move on again, which is going to happen very slowly, I think. Let me see. I don't know why the slides aren't moving on. Ah, here we go. Right. So a bit more detail on what's in the complaint handling code, because this is really important, I think, to those of you who are residents, because it's there not just for us to hold landlords to account, but for you as residents. So either as individual residents, or if you run a committee or a scrutiny panel, then use the code, look through it, and you can say to your landlord, well, we don't think you're doing this, or shouldn't you be revising your procedure on this bit because the code says you should do this, because they must comply with the code. So I hope you will use it as an active document to support you. I'm not going to go through every detail in it because that would not be appropriate, it would be a bit dull, but importantly, it does set out a broad definition of a complaint. And what it explains is that a complaint can be any expression of dissatisfaction with the service being delivered. So first of all, there's a service request. That's not a complaint. That's when someone phones up and says, you know, I've got a leaking tap, it needs to be repaired. So you're not happy it's leaking, but if it's the first time you've told the landlord, that's a report. If you then phone back a week later and say, well, I reported that leaking tap, and you said someone was coming round on Friday, but they didn't come, or they came round, but it's not been fixed, I want to complain about that, then that's a complaint. And we make clear that you don't necessarily have to use the word complaint. You don't say, I want to make a formal complaint. The landlord should be able to identify that you wish to make a complaint and log a complaint if that's what you wish to do. There's quite a lot in the code about making sure that the complaints procedure is accessible and that residents are aware of it. So this touches on the points that you were raising earlier. So the landlord should be publicising its complaints procedure, not just on its website, but in any materials, and it should be publicising the role of the Ombudsman, not just in its final decision letter, but in other decision letters and anything else that's relevant to complaints. So it doesn't have to put it in every rent statement, but if it was doing a tenant's handbook or a newsletter, it would be, it would be appropriate to include a bit there about this is the role of the Ombudsman, this is how you contact them. And there should be stuff on the website. There has to be detail in that final decision letter about how do you contact us if you're not happy. So quite a lot around accessibility awareness. Also, we've said there that landlords should make sure that residents can complain in as many ways as possible and in at least more than one way. And that is because we had some landlords, there's a couple I can think of who were quite large, who said, well, we only now take complaints via our online complaint form, which we thought wasn't acceptable because not every resident uses a computer or is able to use a computer. So there should be more ways than one. You should be able to send a letter, make a complaint by telephone if someone might have difficulties writing, etc. And some landlords will go beyond that, accept complaints via Facebook or Twitter. You don't have to do that, but those are additional. But they should make sure all the basic ways of complaining are available to residents. The code sets out timescales for complaints handling and the number of stages. So it says that we recommend and much prefer two-stage complaints procedure. In the past, a lot of landlords had 3 or 4 or even 5 stages. Complaints would just trundle along for over a year before they could come to the Ombudsman. So generally, we think the complaint should be able to be handled in 2 stages. There can be a 3rd stage, and that's only generally going to be if there's residents involved. So some sort of panel that would involve residents. Otherwise, you can have a 3rd stage, but we very much encourage 6 stage. There should never be only 1 stage, which we had some landlords only had a 1-stage procedure in the past, and we thought that wasn't in line with natural justice because it didn't give an opportunity to review it, but somebody independent looks again at your complaint. And there shouldn't be 4 stages. We do still have a few local authorities, because we only took over responsibility for local authorities in 2013, who have a final corporate stage, and we're constantly arguing with them about how they can comply with the Housing Ombudsman Code, because they've got other services as well that their complaints procedure applies to, and they have a 4-stage procedure. Hopefully that will be resolved, because we're going to produce a joint complaint handling code with the local government ombudsman, which should resolve that issue. So the timescales, there's timescales for each stage. I won't go through them in detail, but the basic timescale is 10 days, 10 calendar days, 10 working days at stage 1 and 20 working days at stage 2. But there is flexibility for the landlord to have longer, which I think is important, because we're aware when I investigated complaints at the Ombudsman, one complaint might be about how a leaking tap was dealt with. Another complaint might be about 3 years of very serious antisocial behaviour. So it's going to take the landlord longer to collect the evidence and send a proper response on that second issue. And we would rather, and I'm sure you would rather, they sent a meaningful response in 15 days or 20 days than just send a response that hadn't been really investigated or thought through to hit the 10-day deadline. So they can extend those deadlines, but they should explain why and get the resident's agreement. And if you, as a resident, think, no, it's not reasonable, it's a very simple complaint, they want another 20 days, you can come to us and we will make a decision of whether that landlord can extend that timescale further. So there's a stop. They can't just keep extending it without our permission. Putting things right. So there's a whole section in the code about putting things right. So, we accept that things do go wrong sometimes. Even the best organisations will make mistakes. The important thing then is to put things right, to apologise. It might be appropriate to pay compensation. You might need to carry out some repairs to put things right. So we set out what we expect there. If a landlord does put everything right, in our view, through the complaints procedure, so in its final response, it says, we apologise, we offer this compensation, we're going to do this work. If we think that's a satisfactory response, then we won't find maladministration against that landlord. We'll say there was what's called reasonable redress. Yes, they got things wrong, but they've provided reasonable redress. So our decision is really looking at, was the landlord's final decision on your complaint reasonable or not? That's what we're looking at. We also have a really important chapter, section of the code on learning and improvement. So we expect when things do go wrong, that landlords set out what they've learned from that complaint and what they're going to do as a result, so that we don't see the same complaints about the same issues coming back time and again. And that's an issue we've really focused on in the last couple of years. And myself and a colleague have been running workshops for landlords and residents about how in practice you can learn from complaints. You know, you review your complaints perhaps every quarter, you see if there's any themes, you then try and look at what went wrong in those services, and you do an action plan of how you're going to improve. Governing bodies. Now, this wasn't in the original code, but in April this year, we added in requirements that governing bodies should have some involvement in complaints. And specifically, that there should be somebody on the governing body. And by governing body, I mean the council members, or the board of a housing association. So somebody on that governing body should have lead responsibility for making sure that periodically that governing body gets information about complaints. So the person doesn't have to be involved in complaint handling at all. It's just their role to make sure that that information is coming from the staff, is going to the governing body. So the governing body has an awareness, not just of the number of complaints, and how many were dealt with within the timescales, but what are they about? You know, what are the main reasons for complaints, and what has been done as a result? So we're really interested in looking at the quality side. You know, what were the responses like, rather than just looking at the timescales. Self-assessment, this is really important. So at the back of the code is a self-assessment form, and every landlord is required to complete that self-assessment form. So it goes through lots of questions around, you know, timescales, how well complaints are handled, how many are upheld, how many are referred on to the Ombudsman. Does it have somebody from the governing body with responsibility? So it's a checklist of making sure they're doing everything right, and they are now required to complete that self-assessment once a year. And we say it's good practice, not a requirement, but it's good practice to involve residents in carrying out that self-assessment as well. And that brings me on to the final point. So we do stress the value of resident involvement in complaint handling in general. So it could be residents involved in a complaint panel. Not so often these days, but very often there is a complaint scrutiny panel. So it's not looking at the individual complaint, but a panel that will look at the complaints procedure, might look at a batch of complaints in retrospect to see how they were handled, will give advice to the landlord about improving its information and publicity around the complaints procedure. So if your landlord doesn't do that, we would, you know, we don't say they have to do it, but we highly recommend it. And, you know, you can point them to the code to support you in that. Okay.
John,
should I pause there, Darren?
Yeah, that would be great. So, excellent, really clear, John. Just we've had a question which is on that theme, so it's probably an appropriate time just to pause to take that question, and I'm going to add one to it as well. So hopefully I'll make. So yep. I think you've probably addressed some of this where you covered about definition of a complaint, but we've heard from Brian about how many landlords are still using the term informal, so kind of an informal complaint, or I guess it's that expression of dissatisfaction again, isn't it, that comes back to as a way of avoiding getting the Housing Ombudsman involved, or even avoiding going through a formal complaints process. And I know from previous kind of discussions with residents about this is that they kind of feel like they're in this kind of almost like a time warp, that they just go round and round, say, but I'm unhappy about this, and they go, oh, it's just informal, we'll sort it out, and they never kind of get through the kind of formal process. I suppose, given what you've just said about the code and the self-assessment, because Brian's kind of conclusion to that is, how can the Housing Ombudsman Service help tenants around this? And I guess in some respects, the code is designed to help tenants get around that, because presumably, if landlords are taking that approach, that's in direct contravention to the code. So I'll give you a moment just to think about that. But the additional bit that I'll just add around that is, you mentioned about self-assessment and landlords being required to self-assess against the code. Are you auditing that? Because I guess there's a kind of a follow-up is, well, if landlords fail to do it, what's the consequences?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, no, the first question is a really good one, and it's probably around informal complaint handling. It's probably the one we're asked about since the code came out in 2020. We've been asked about the most. Mainly it's landlords who ask questions about it, residents do as well. And it is a really tricky area, and I haven't really touched on it, so I'll go into a bit more detail. I could, if I have time while someone's asking a question, I could put a link to the code in the chat if people want to look at it, or they could find it on our website. If you do look at the code, if I get a chance, I'll put it in the chat. The one to look at is paragraph 4.1, which I was partly involved in drafting. It was quite hard to get it right, which tackles this issue. So the problem we had was a lot of landlords said to us when we first drafted the code, before we introduced it, some of them said, well, look, 80% of problems, let's just call them problems, that are reported to us, we resolve informally before it's a formal complaint. Are you saying that we can't do that? Because that means those 80% of residents, instead of it just getting resolved in a day or two, are going to have to log a formal complaint and wait 10 days. So there's this really difficult dilemma, because on the one hand, obviously, we're in favour of resolving issues as quickly as possible. So we want them to do that. If the resident's happy to resolve something, that's fine. On the other hand, we don't want to give landlords a get out where they'll say, oh, well, no, we're not going to log a complaint on this because we're going to deal with it informally. So we've tried to address that in 4.1, which basically says that it doesn't use the word informal because we don't particularly like that. It says the Ombudsman encourages the early and local resolution of issues between landlords and residents, and recognise that there may be times appropriate actions can be agreed immediately. So yes, they can do that, because if that's what the resident wants, that's fine. So there's two provisos there. One is it's got to be an agreement with the resident. If the resident says, no, I want to log a formal complaint, then they should log a formal complaint. If the resident says, you know, I don't want you to go away and try and resolve this in 2 days. Second one, it should be reasonably quick. We don't specify, but we're talking, you know, 2 or 3 days probably. It depends on the issue. And also the landlord should keep a log, you know, it should write down details, because if it ends up coming to us, if it does get resolved, but later on something goes wrong, it comes to us, we'll want to see evidence. So I think that was a fair compromise. That's what 4.1 says. So in practice, you know, if you've got a larger landlord and somebody complains to their housing officer on the ground that, oh, you know, that contractor, the caretaker didn't come yesterday, I want to make a complaint. They were meant to move that rubbish, and the housing officer says, well, I can get them to come around this afternoon. Is that all right? And somebody says yes, then that's fine. You know, should they go through the complaints procedure? Well, not unless they really want to. So it's giving them scope to do that, but it's always going to be a slightly difficult area. But ultimately, remember, the resident has to agree to it being dealt with informally. We do specifically say in that section that in the complaints procedure, which is published, which has stage 1 and stage 2, we don't want to see an additional stage named stage. People used to have a stage 0, or one of them had a stage called grumbles and moans. So had all these fancy words for very initial complaints, which effectively was an extra stage, confusing for residents. So we just said, if you've got some other stage, that is stage 1. You know, you're having a stage, you might call it something else, but that's stage 1. Your complaints procedure should have stage 1, stage 2, possibly stage 3. Anything you do before that to resolve an issue really quickly can only be done with the resident's agreement. That's a long, waffly answer. I hope that answers that one. On the self-assessment, yes. Well, the bottom line is that no, we don't. Landlords aren't required to send us the self-assessment. They are required to complete it annually, and that's each calendar year from April to March, and to publish it, to have it reported to their governing body and to publish it on their website. Now, in practice, if we said you must send it to us, or we could look at all the websites. That's 2,000 landlords. We have very relatively few staff. We just couldn't look at 2,000 self-assessments. So they don't have to do that. However, and this happens regularly, if we pick up something through our investigations of complaints, and we investigate in thousands of complaints a year, we pick up concerns about a landlord, we'll look at their complaint policy and we'll look at their self-assessment. And if we find, which we often do, that it hasn't been completed or something's not satisfactory in it, then we'll take that up with the landlord, and we might serve, as we often have, a complaint handling failure order. So it's not perfect, but we just don't have the resources to audit everyone, but we audit when we have a concern or if a resident raises a concern with us. Did you want to come back on either of this?
Yeah, okay. That's great, John. Thank you. You've answered my question.
Right. I think this might be the last slide, although there's quite a lot on it. Yes. And I think, how are we doing for time, Darren? I think we had.
Yeah, we're doing well. We've officially we've got until about 12:45.
Right. I'll try and go a bit quicker through this bit so there's time for further questions. But these were this update about what's been happening and what is happening. So we mentioned at the beginning, we wanted to know about landlords' performance. I think the overall picture, if I give you an overall update on landlords' performance, is that it could be better. In the complaints that come to us, and obviously we have to be aware that people only bring complaints to us if they're very unhappy. So we're not seeing most complaints that get resolved before they come to us. And landlords always point that out and say, well, you don't see the 90% of complaints that never go to the Ombudsman. That is true. But of the ones that do come to us, we do find maladministration in about 40 to 45%, varies year on year. And in recent years, that's gone up slightly. It's up towards the 45%. So it's nearly half of the cases we find maladministration. In very few limited cases, we can also make a finding of severe maladministration. So that's really serious failures. And I was looking at the figures on this just to give you an idea. And I think we started using that finding, severe maladministration, in 2019-20. We made 5 of those findings that year. The next year we made 3. But then in 21-22, which may have been affected by COVID, we made 11. And in the current financial year, we have made, there's 8 on the website. I know there's a further 2 that have been made, yet to be posted. That's 10. And we've still got another 5 months of the year to go. So it's going to be, this year is going to be much higher number of severe maladministration cases. I don't think anyone, we don't have the research to know why that is. It could be landlords may say the Ombudsman is getting tougher. We've introduced the code, so we set better benchmarks. Residents may say landlords are performing poorly. There's been, I think, particularly around issues like damp and mould, which have been in the news a lot the last year. So a lot of landlords struggling with conditioned their property. They don't have the level of resources that they think they need to invest in their properties. And so we are seeing some more serious complaints coming to us. So I can't give you the reason. I think your analysis of that would be just as valuable as mine as to why that might be. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we've done a lot more in recent years, particularly the last 3 years since the present Ombudsman, Richard Blakeway, came into post. He introduced the publication of all our investigation reports. So we didn't used to publish our investigation before. We now publish all our reports on the website. They name the landlord. They don't name the resident. But all the detail is there, unless it's something like an antisocial behaviour case where we may have to take out detail because of confidentiality and data protection reasons. So in that sense, we're naming and shaming landlords. Where landlords have been found to have maladministration, you can read that report on the website. We also publish and press release all the severe maladministration cases. So there was a press release, I think, 2 weeks ago about the latest 2 cases, which were against Southern Housing Group for severe maladministration. And we're also now, just the last 2 years, publishing annual performance reports for each landlord. And they're on the website. So you can look up your landlord. You can see how many complaints we got, how many findings of maladministration we found, and how that compares with others across the country or others in that sector, other housing associations, for example. So again, that's a way of providing, I think, transparency and information, not just to residents, but to landlord staff as well, on how they're performing. I should say on that, if you do look up your landlord and there's no report, that would be, we don't publish reports where we get less than 5 complaints a year. So I guess that's a good thing if you're not on there. We now have, as I've mentioned, these new types of orders, complaint handling failure orders. If we think the landlord's handling the complaint poorly, we can serve an order saying, right, you now need to do this by this date. You need to escalate that complaint and respond to it by this date. And we're doing those wider systemic investigations where we have a particular concern about a landlord. And one of those will be published in the next couple of weeks. We've also, over the last 3 or 4 years, done our spotlight reports. So these are quite long reports on a particular issue. We've done 6 to date on issues such as repairs, cladding. We did cladding last year. Damp and mould in October, which got a lot of publicity. And we would base those reports on cases we've seen over the last year or two. And we will put in there recommendations for landlords for good practice for improvement. So those are really important reports in terms of trying to drive improvement in the sector. They're all on the website. The next one, just out of interest, I think it's due to be published within the next few weeks, is on noise. So look out for that. It'll be on our website. That should be an interesting read. Future changes. So future on Saturday, the abolition of the designated person process. You no longer have to wait 8 weeks before coming to the Ombudsman. There's no longer that extra stage. You can go to a councillor, an MP, or a tenant panel. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't, if you're not happy about your landlord, you can't go to your councillor, your MP. You can do that, as you've always been able to, or to a tenant panel, but it won't be part of the complaint process. It won't be a requirement before you go to the Ombudsman. So in that sense, I think it's a benefit to residents. It allows you, like with other ombudsmen, just to bring the complaint straight to us. If you want to involve your councillor as your representative, then that's up to you. Also, other big changes, which you're probably not going to see on the ground for a while, but the regulator of social housing is introducing tenant satisfaction measures. And this really, again, comes from the concerns after Grenfell that residents not being able to hold their landlords to account. So every landlord will have to publish, there's 22, I think they were published last week, there's 22 areas of satisfaction which they're going to have to measure each year. How they do that, I don't know. I think there'll be a lot of debate as to whether they're doing that properly or not. They'll publish those, residents will be able to see them, the regulator will be able to look at them and compare different landlords. And that's another way in which they might be able to identify any problem areas. So that's coming in. That's not us, but it does cross over with us because we will still look at individual complaints. The regulator will be looking more at the whole landlord's performance, but there will be some crossover. We'll refer concerns to the regulator will refer individual complainants to us. And finally, so that you've got time to ask you some questions, I mentioned earlier, we're working with the local government and social care ombudsman, who cover most local authority complaints, on a joint complaint handling code, because it's quite difficult for councils at the moment where their housing department is subject to our code, but their other departments aren't subject to the Housing Ombudsman's Code. And there is some crossover there. The LGSCO deals with complaints about homelessness and complaints about private sector housing, for example. We deal pretty much with council housing complaints, day-to-day complaints about repairs. So the council as a landlord, we don't deal with homelessness complaints. So that was, sorry, that was a bit of a quick run through, but I'm very happy to, I know Darren will probably field the questions, but there's some in the chat, or if people want to ask a question, it's lovely to hear from people rather than just listen to me drone on. How do you want to do it, Darren?
Okay, that's brilliant. I'll come back in now. I've stopped the sharing of the screen, so hopefully we can see each other and stuff. Yeah, there's been a few more questions. And I think I'll probably go to that first. We've got about 10 minutes to cover some additional things. But I'm going to go to Brian's kind of second. It's his second question. Yeah, I think it's his second question of the day.
Yeah.
I don't think you'll probably be able to answer kind of some aspects of the question, because I think you're probably going to be restricted in what you can say. But I guess what the point that Brian is making in his question is that he's highlighting something which was highlighted by the government's Housing Select Committee recent report. So the Housing Select Committee is a cross-party select committee which looks into various topical themes. And one of the themes that they've been looking at since kind of the end of 2021 was the regulation of social housing. And certainly one of the key sort of findings of the first report from that select committee was the imbalance of power that there is between landlords and tenants. And therefore the impact that then has on things like the communication, whether tenants can trust the communication coming from their landlord, whether there's a controlling influence. And certainly they came down in their report on the basis that they do recognise there is this quite significant imbalance of power. So I'm going to word it slightly differently just to allow you to maybe to give some comment. What Brian's asking is where there is the presence of an independent tenant voice. So his question is that encouraged? But I guess the question would be: have you seen any evidence from the Ombudsman's activities where there is an independent tenant voice, which has brought something additional? I guess is that something which you've seen? And if you can't say any more than that, I'll come back in on some views from TAROE Trust on this in this area.
Yeah, I've read the question in the chat. I think it's not that I can't say, I'm happy to say anything about it, but it's slightly, I think this is, I don't want to pass the buck, but I think this is going to be more the role of the regulator than us. So, primarily whatever work we do is driven by, it's an individual tenant complaining about their problem in their property. Or it could be a group of tenants complaining about the lift, or, but they're all complaining about one specific landlord-tenant issue. It's often repairs, it might be antisocial behaviour. So we aren't a body that would look at overall, how that landlord is working with residents, resident involvement, etc. That would be the regulator, which has the tenant standards, and it has standards around engagement and resident involvement, which I'm sure a lot of you, and Darren might want to say something about that, probably think, yeah, they're there, but they've really not counted for anything in the past because the regulator doesn't get involved in monitoring them or doing anything about them unless there's a really serious case, which used to be gas safety, serious detriment. Now that is changing, or the idea is that's changing by introducing the regulator, introducing tenant satisfaction measures, see how the landlord performs across a whole range of areas. So it's not perfect, but that would be more, we're not likely, if we picked up on a concern, if residents wrote to us about concern about they were being blocked, their communication being blocked, we would probably have to refer that on to the regulator, because we can only look at complaints about, it's almost complaints about your tenancy, your repairs aren't being carried out, or the landlord isn't dealing with your report of antisocial behaviour. So I've slightly dodged that one, Darren.
Yeah, no, that's good, John. It's just helpful to know if there's, for you to get your position on some of these areas. I think I can probably come back in there and say our take on this. Certainly, you mentioned about the Green Paper earlier, and there was quite a bit on tenant voice in the Green Paper, which had come kind of in the post-Grenfell roadshows and discussions. And it was quite disappointing, therefore, that in the White Paper, which came out November 2020, there was not very much on an independent tenant voice. There was some stuff on tenant voice as a kind of primarily between the landlord and the tenant, but as an independent tenant voice, kind of either as a national, regional, or even local level, there was not anything on there. We think that that was an opportunity missed. We've said that publicly on a number of occasions. And I think going back to the Select Committee report, it was made very clear within that that is an area which has been omitted, that there's a gap there within the regulatory framework. And it's interesting that the government were due to respond. The deadline for the government response was the 20th of September, and that's now overdue. They have not responded on time. So we are monitoring and looking as to when the government is going to be able to make this response to some of those recommendations. So yes, we definitely think that there should be local, regional, and national bodies, including an independent national tenant voice, and we've been pushing for that for some time. We think that that would help.
Yeah. Can I just quickly add? It's not directly on that, but I should have mentioned, because people might be interested. We at the Ombudsman have now have what's called a resident panel. This was only set up about, I think it's a year ago. It's during COVID, and we set up as a virtual panel. We were going to have 100 members, but 600 applied. And we thought, well, because things were being done virtually, as long as people met the bare minimum that showed that they were a resident of social housing, etc., we had all 600 come on. And we have groups of those residents that we talk to various things. But I don't want to pretend it's anything like you're talking about here, because that's really a sounding board for us about things we're doing within the Ombudsman. It's not a tenant voice across the country in any way. But just to make you aware it's there. They're not actually recruiting any more members at the moment, but they probably will be in future. So you can keep an eye on the website if you want to join that.
Really pleased you came in on that, John. It was on my list of things to come back to you about, actually. So you've addressed that already. It was going to be a subsequent question, but it flows quite nicely from that, though, because the other part of Brian's question is about the regulator. And I guess the regulator is only able to do what is put within legislation for them to have powers for them. So clearly there is going to be, under the kind of the changes which are going through Parliament at the moment under the Social Housing Regulation Bill, there are proposals in that which will enable the regulator to adopt a proactive consumer regulation role. They will have to review the consumer-related standards, which include the tenant involvement and empowerment standard. So there is going to be some change on that. It doesn't so far, though, as I've mentioned, go as far as having an independent tenant voice. What I should highlight, though, is that there has been, as a kind of more recent development, directly from government, or the government DLUC, the government department which covers housing. They have also, and really I think they've used the Ombudsman resident panel model as something which they're seeking to replicate. They have recently been recruiting and are in the process of setting up a resident panel, which is time limited and it has limited scope, but is a national panel to look at the implement and oversee and to introduce accountability on the implementation of the white paper, of which there are aspects which relate to complaints. So I don't know if anybody in today's session has put themselves forward or have been informed that they've been successful on that DLUC resident panel. At the moment, they've only committed to 2 years, 6 meetings, but that might form the basis of a longer term and broad resident panel with broader scope that we've been calling for. But so it's better than nothing, but not ideal, I think, is our position. So I'm aware of time, so I'll move on. But these are going to have to be really quick fire, John, on questions. Cyril's asked about failure to insulate properties being included. Very topical given the issue of cost of living. I'm guessing this probably flows from, it depends on what the service standards are for the Housing Ombudsman Service, but failure to insulate properties being included?
Yeah, I don't remember ever getting a complaint specifically on that. I mean, what we would do, it would be great if all properties were insulated, which they're not, but we would only really be able to deal with the complaint or uphold it if the landlord wasn't complying with any legal responsibilities under the present legislation. So, you know, if it wasn't, it's a bit like soundproofing, for example. There are minimum standards. If a landlord wasn't meeting those minimum standards, we could certainly fine against them, but we can't make a fine against them just because it would be good if they provided better insulation. So hopefully that will be something that will change in the future with a programme of insulating social housing properties.
I guess we should probably add, we're aware that there's a review of the Decent Home Standards.
Yeah.
Under the
Yeah.
review of the Decent Home Standards, they should be incorporating and introducing kind of thermal efficiency standards as part of the zero carbon agenda. Now that's going to take some time, but clearly if that comes into place and there are set standards, there's both the regulatory issue there, but there may be an individual complaint issue if standards are not being met on that side. But at the moment, it's probably something for the future.
Yeah.
Next question here from Michelle, probably going to have to be our last question as well, is we often hear this, is tenants concerned to raise a complaint because of the kind of the impact of potential reprisals, consequences of that, upsetting their landlord and the impact on them in terms of the service in the future. Anything that you can add on that position?
Well, it's something we often hear as well. The residents are concerned, say they're concerned about as well. It's really difficult. There's nothing, I don't think there's, if I'm honest, there's nothing we can do to guarantee. I've never come across a case where I've found that this has happened, but of course, we probably wouldn't know if it had happened. So all that we can do is assure residents that they can come to us in confidence if necessary. If they think the landlord is treating them differently because they've raised complaints, then they should provide that evidence to us and we can look into it. Never actually found this in the past, but we would look into it and we could serve a complaint handling failure order, or, you know, if it was quite serious, we would refer that to the regulator, because that's almost an issue around the governance of that organisation. If we said, look, there's clear evidence you're treating this person differently from that one, and they've made a number of complaints. But no simple solutions to that. But certainly don't be worried about coming to us. And generally, however poor you might think your landlord is at delivering services, I don't think most of them would treat you differently because you made a complaint. I can't guarantee it, but not the ones that I've come across.
Yeah, I mean, the only other thing I'd probably add on that is that this ultimately stems from a failure of organisational culture.
Yeah.
If an organisation would do that, and certainly the changes from the white paper, the shift to proactive consumer regulation as well, is all designed to try and kind of move away from that position. So you would hope with the kind of the changes that are in the pipeline that the potential for that to happen should also reduce. But given our role sort of today and in the past, it would be difficult to say that couldn't happen. Actually,
can I very quickly add on that, because I should have said, where this often comes up is residents will say, well, they keep making complaints and the landlord now has decided they're not behaving reasonably. Landlord has restricted their access or applied their unreasonable behaviour policies to that resident. Then you can bring a complaint to us saying this policy has been applied to us inappropriately and we will investigate that. We might not uphold it, but we ask the landlord, well, why? What's your policy? Why have you restricted this person's access? What's that based on? So we can look into those cases.
Brilliant, John. Okay, so before we wrap up, just two additional points. Really, you've mentioned one already, John, for me, and that was only last Wednesday. The regulator has published its final suite of tenant satisfaction measures. It's available on the regulator's website. We've been promoting it as well through our standard different channels to highlight that that's now been finalised. The other point I was going to highlight was that there is a consultation that the government's DLUC department has issued, I think it was the 31st of August, and that's going to run until the 12th of October. Again, really topical subject given the cost of living and the high inflation that we're experiencing nationally. And the link between inflation and rents is a consultation on rents as to whether there's going to be any limit to the rents that are going to, so the rent formula that is due to be applied from next April, and the consultation actually asks whether this is going to be restricted for 2 years, and they give some things there. So we've got a draft consultation response that we've issued. It's on our website. We welcome any views and feedback from tenants on that to check whether we got it right in terms of our response to the capping. Generally, we're saying, you know, there's a need, especially in the short term, to protect individuals' household finances, and we think that there's a role there for government to cap rent, at least in the short term, possibly with some catch-up period to allow, for discussion with tenants about longer-term investment decision-making within that landlord, but that it's of paramount importance at the moment that individual tenant households are protected, given the extremely high inflation that we're experiencing. So thank you, John. We wish you, and I can see there's been some comments as well in the chat, that we all collectively wish you the very best of luck for the future. Hopefully we may even get to welcome you back in another capacity as well in the future. But in the meantime, we wish you the very best of luck. Thank you again for joining us today, and thanks to everybody else who's joined us on this session. We hope that it was helpful. We've got our next webinar back in the usual slot tomorrow morning, where we're welcoming some guest speakers from Amnesty International on a recent report that they've issued. So thank you once again, and goodbye.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.